some of you may have been here before and be familiar with this rather wonderful picture that we have on display in the museum. In 2013, the museum began an association with the Charitable Trust through the loan of the Caravaggio, which is hanging downstairs in the galleries. And it's of course wonderful for us as a museum to have that work on display, but in addition to just having this work on display, it makes a really interesting point in the narrative of the history of the Order of St. John, as Caravaggio is a knight of the Order of St. John. And previously we weren't really able to discuss that story within our museum or collection because we didn't have anything to represent that. And this painting that is on display in the museum has now a very similar role. This came later to the museum through that first association built on that. And the St. John's Gate was, in the 18th century, a coffee house which was owned by Richard Hogarth, William Hogarth's father. His USP for his coffee house was that everyone should speak Latin, and shockingly that didn't catch on with people, so the business didn't do too well. But even so, we have this wonderful association with William Hogarth, who was a child who would have visited this building, and is, of course, an incredibly famous and renowned English artist. And now we have this work after Hogarth from the Industry and Idleness series, this very interesting oil sketch. And we have that on display in the galleries, and for the numerous guided tours that go on throughout these buildings, we have a couple of guides here this evening who do an amazing job. We can engage with this narrative too and bring out another story within the wonderful range of stories that relate to this building and to the history of the Order of St. John. So I'm going to hand over to Claire Shepherd, who is now working at the Courtauld again, and did the conservation work on this oil sketchbook, so will be telling us a bit more about it, and we can learn some more about the picture. So thank you very much.
So yes, as Tom mentioned, this is a painting that I worked on while I was at the Courtauld as a student at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where I was training on the postgraduate diploma in the conservation of easel paintings. When it came into the studio, oh, sorry, I'll stand back and dart forwards to change the slides. So when it came into the studio, the painting was very dark and many of the details were quite illegible. So on the left, that's what the painting looked like when I first saw it. And it was quite difficult to tell what we were really looking at. We knew, thanks to the painting's owner, that this quirky and intriguing painting related to the print by William Hogarth, and that it was thought to be roughly contemporary an 18th century painting. But the condition of the painting made it difficult to see the composition clearly. So over the next few months, I worked on uncovering more about the painting using various methods of technical examination to find out more information, and removing dirt, varnish, and later overpaint in order to reveal something a bit closer to what the painting would originally have looked like. I'll be talking about the technical examination and the treatment a bit later, but first I want to just give a bit of background and context for the composition, which derives from a print that Hogarth made in 1747 as part of his series Industry and Idleness. This series of engravings consisted of 12 plates, which told the moralizing tale of Tom Idle and Francis Goodchild, two young apprentices who, as their names suggest, take very different attitudes to work and whose lives take very different paths as a result. So I'll just run through the story of that series so we kind of get an idea of what our painting's showing. And the differences between the two protagonists are immediately clear from the first plate in the series, which is titled The Fellow Prentices at Their Loom. So the angelic Francis Goodchild is on the right. He's working diligently at his loom with a pristine copy of a book called The Prentice's Guide at his feet, while idle Tom drunkenly snores away alongside a tankard of beer with his own copy of The Prentice's Guide in tatters at his feet. And above the head of Tom Idle on the left, there's a broadsheet ballad, which you can't read in this slide, but it's got writing on it that says that it's about Moll Flanders, who was famously a character of dubious virtue, whereas Francis Goodchild is sitting below a paper that refers to R. Whittington, Lord Mayor, who is, of course, a reference to the tale of Dick Whittington, who rose from apprenticeship to become Lord Mayor of London. And the master weaver, you can just see at the back of the room, is a moment away from exacting punishment on Tom with a bludgeon. And right from the start, we've really got kind of the futures of our two protagonists quite clearly foreshadowed. You sort of get a sense of where this is going to be going. In the next plate, we see Francis, in the picture on the left, performing the duty of a Christian. He is earnestly singing a hymn in church alongside the daughter of his master. Meanwhile, Tom is outside the church with some quite dodgy-looking characters, using a tomb as a gambling table with various skulls and bones scattered quite ominously around his feet. By the time we get to plate 4, Francis has become such a hard worker that he's become a favourite of his master and he's been entrusted with a share in the business. Tom, however, has proved to be too untamable for gainful employment and has been turned away from the workshop. So we see him being shipped out to the Navy with a threat of punishment from the guy on the left holding a cat o' nine tails. It's kind of ever present. Francis's hard work pays off. He finishes his apprenticeship and he gets married to none other than his master's daughter. So here he's taking a moment to pay the musicians who are serenading the happy couple on their wedding day. Tom's choice of female companion is a little less virtuous. The title of this plate sort of sums it up. It's called The Idle Prentice Returned from Sea and in a Garret with a Common Prostitute. Sort of very Hogarthian title for a print, I think. And this is the plate that forms the basis of the painting that I'm going to be talking about today, and there's some quite rich narrative detail that I'll be coming to later. But after we leave Tom in the painting, the story progresses. The industrious apprentice is now elevated to the ranks of London's elite. He and his wife get to enjoy a grand banquet as he's now made Sheriff of London, while the idle apprentice suffers the consequences of consorting with undesirables. His prostitute companion has sold him out, and while he's happily counting the proceeds of his life of crime, he's unaware of the officer approaching behind to arrest him. And we can just see in the bottom right corner the sight of a corpse being stuffed down a cellar trap door, which sort of hints that Tom might be mixed up in more than just a bit of pickpocketing. This turn of affairs results in the two apprentices being brought face to face again for the first time since plate 1. Francis Goodchild is now Alderman of London, and he puts his head in his hands at the sight of the desperate Tom Idle being brought before him in chains. Tom's appeals go unanswered as his criminal associate testifies against him. In the penultimate print, where we move to this kind of widescreen panorama format, Tom's at the centre of a procession to the gallows at Tyburn. He's surrounded by soldiers and jeering onlookers who fight, drink, and scramble up the stands to watch the spectacle. The two skeletons you can just see kind of framing either side of the print tell us what's coming next. Meanwhile, Francis Goodchild is at the centre of a rather different occasion. Seated in a gold coach, surrounded by well-wishers and watched by the Prince of Wales, the industrious apprentice has now been made Lord Mayor of London, his reward for his life of dutiful hard work. Instead of skeletons, he is framed on either side by two abundant cornucopias hinting at a long life of plenty to come. Industry and Idleness was published in September of 1747 and marks a new era of more broad characterization and more sort of explicit and unambiguous moralizing in Hogarth's output. Unlike the previous popular series Marriage a la Mode and The Harlot's Progress, Hogarth didn't actually make any paintings associated with this series. His usual practice was to make the series of paintings first, and these would then be used as advertisements to encourage collectors to stump up cash for the engravings that would then be made from the paintings. But with Industry and Idleness, the intention was to make a more populist and mass market series which would be available and affordable for a much wider audience. The series was sold at 12 shillings, a shilling a plate, and there was also a more exclusive and smaller edition on better quality paper, which was sold at a higher price for the more elite collectors who were sort of Hogarth's more traditional market. 12 shillings was still a lot for the average worker. It would be almost a month's wages for an artisan or journeyman, but it did make the prints accessible to a more general middle-class audience than had been possible with his prints before. Industry and Idleness apparently sold particularly well around Christmas time, when the prints were bought by masters as gifts for their apprentices. And there were also examples of teachers buying sets of the print to hang on schoolrooms, and there were even sermons preached on the subject of the theme of the series. And as Hogarth himself wrote later in 1760, this specific series was, quote, calculated for the use and instruction of youth, wherein everything necessary to be known was to be made as intelligible as possible. And as fine engraving was not necessary to the main design, provided that which is infinitely more material, viz., that characters and expressions were well preserved, the purchase of them became within the reach of those for whom they were chiefly intended. So clearly, this was a print series that had a really wide reach. It was displayed prominently in print shops across London, and it would have been seen and talked about by a wide range of people. Unlicensed copies of Hogarth's popular prints made by other people had always proliferated, to the point that he'd played an instrumental role in an early piece of copyright legislation, the 1734 Copyright Act, which is often referred to as Hogarth's Act, which attempted to crack down on the market for cheap pirate copies of prints. The Act protected engravers' rights for 14 years from the publication of an original image, although it has to be said that the Act was initially not wholly effective, and unlicensed copies continued to be widespread. It's no surprise that the prints were popular enough to be copied. What's less common is to find a painting that's copied after one of the prints. While it was painted in a very quick and expedient manner, and so it might have been part of a whole set of small-scale painted replicas of all 12 of the prints, it's obviously not a mass-produced reproduction in the same way as the army of London printmakers who were making their own versions of Hogarth's images, which was so much more common. But the painting, as I said, takes the composition from the 7th print in the series, The Idle Prentice Returned from Sea. So this is the stage at which Tom Idle has returned from the sea voyage that he embarked on after being sacked from his apprenticeship. He's now turned to a life of crime, and he's in hiding in this sleazy garret with his dubious companion, who's gleefully admiring all the watches and jewellery that Tom has liberated from their owners' pockets. The floor around their bed is strewn with the detritus of their lowly situation. So I'll point some of these out because they're quite small details, but that's easy on here. There's a bottle of gin, there's a pair of guns, there's a kind of cracked and broken jar on the floor down here, and there's even a rat just you can catch scurrying away in a dark corner there. Tom, fearing the law will catch up with him, has barricaded the doors of the room and hung his companion's hooped crinoline skirt over the curtainless windows to keep out prying eyes. He's in such a fearful condition that he's startled by the sound of a cat tumbling down the chimney, presumably chasing after the rat that's scurrying away in the corner. It's notable that the painting shows the composition oriented in the same direction as the print, which suggests that it was probably copied from the print itself rather than from any preparatory work, because the sketch for the print is, of course, flipped when the print is made. There is a preparatory drawing that Hogarth made for this print in the collection of the British Museum, which shows some of the details that Hogarth changed when he came to actually making the prints. So in the drawing, there was a sword originally hanging above the bed, and there's no sign of the rat that we see in the print either. There's kind of a few changes made. The fact that the painting so closely copies the exact details of the print without including any variations that are present in the drawing perhaps kind of contributes to the idea that the painting was made by someone who had access to the freely available print, but might not have had any access to the preparatory material, which would have suggested a closer connection to Hogarth's circle. But when the painting first came in to the studio, the relationship of the painting to the print and the presence of all those details kind of scattered through the room was really not very clear. The painting was obscured by centuries of thick discoloured varnish, dirt, grime, and non-original overpaint that had been added later by another restorer. It had undergone a number of interventions in the past. The painting was lined, which means that the original canvas had been stuck to a new canvas, or in this case, the restorer had used 2 pieces of additional canvas to provide additional support. And this had then been stretched onto a new stretcher. So this is the back of the painting. And this stretcher, I mean, I don't know if everyone's seen the painting or not. It's sort of about the size of an A4 piece of paper, roughly. So it's a very chunky, very robust stretcher, and it's similar to those that were used by sort of 19th century restorers. That's the kind of time that people were using this really robust kind of stretcher. So that's probably when the lining of the painting took place. The canvas and the lining are now very sturdy and stable, so there wasn't any need to carry out any kind of structural repairs to the painting, and that meant that I could focus all of my attention on the aesthetic treatment. So this is where various methods of technical examination came in helpful in understanding more about the condition of the painting and about the layers that had been added on top of the original paint. And I'm going to explain some of these methods as I go along, so if anyone already knows all that stuff, I apologise in advance for kind of repeating what you know already, but just to kind of give a general introduction to the kind of methods that I used on this painting. And one method we use as conservators is to look at a painting's surface with ultraviolet light. Traditional varnishes are usually made from natural resins, which fluoresce under UV light, whereas oil paint usually doesn't, or at least it doesn't as much as a varnish. And so looking at this painting in UV light when it first came into the studio, this is before any treatment was carried out, you can see that someone at some point has made an attempt to remove the varnish just from the light parts of the painting, just from the figures, and they've left the varnish everywhere else. They made no attempt to remove the varnish from that very murky, dark background, and that's probably because darker colours tend to be more difficult to clean because of the way they dry. They tend to be more sensitive to solvents than other colours, especially colours that contain white mixed in. So it's really not uncommon to find paintings where the lighter passages have been cleaned and then the darker passages left alone. So it kind of really disrupts the colour balance. You get these very bright colours, and then the darkest colours are just completely murky and obscured. Photographing the painting in infrared light told us a bit more about what was going on underneath the varnish. So this works by IR wavelengths, penetrate a bit further into the object than normal light does. So it's possible to find out what's happening just below the surface. It's the way it's kind of usually most helpful is in finding the artist's underdrawing in a painting. So drawing materials, carbon-containing materials, show up very clearly in infrared light. So this is just an example to show what that does. This is taken from the National Portrait Gallery's Making Art in Tudor Britain project, where you can see this kind of amazingly crisp drawing that's underneath the paint layers by looking in IR light. In this case, the infrared didn't show any underdrawing, although that doesn't mean that there's none there. But there are kind of a number of reasons why that might not show up. But it was very helpful in seeing more information about what was going on underneath the varnish and to give a bit more of an idea of the condition of the paint that was under there that we couldn't see. It shows more of the surviving details of the paint film. So you can see more details in the architecture in the door. You can see the tricorn hat here that's just tucked in behind the mantelpiece, which is present in the print. And you can see more, kind of some of these details that were darker otherwise. You can see there's a pair of boots down in this corner. You can see that there's the rat scurrying away down in the bottom left. So clearly there was a lot more detail to be seen in the painting than we could see with this obscuring dark varnish on top. Another method that we use in conservation is X-ray radiography. And this is an X-ray of the painting that was taken by Silvia Amato at the Courtauld. And this is a technique that works well because right up until the 20th century, it's pretty much ubiquitous to find lead white is a pigment in European oil paintings, and contains lead and heavy metals, absorb X-rays, so wherever you have lead white in a painting, it shows up very clearly in the X-ray. It's a useful method for looking at damage to paintings and for seeing compositional changes made by the artist. And here what you're seeing are, you can see things like the tacks that hold the canvas to the stretcher, those metal points around the edges. You can see a couple of bits of detritus, those metal pins that had got lodged behind the stretcher at some point in its history. You can kind of see the ghost of the stretcher bars. But you can also see these very small dark patches are where there are small losses in the paint. So from the X-ray, we can see that those are very small and localized damages. And so we knew in advance that removing the varnish wasn't going to reveal any nasty surprises of kind of big old holes or tears or damages that had been covered up. It also gives us a bit more information about the artist's technique. You can tell from the X-ray that the painting has sort of been made in one go without any labored changes to the composition as the artist went on. The figures and all the details in the composition are quite clearly defined. When a painter makes changes during the process of painting, these are often visible in the X-ray. So, for example, when the National Gallery photographed this painting, contemporary painting by Hogarth from the series Marriage a la Mode, you can see in the X-ray a number of changes that Hogarth made. Notably, there are two additional figures here and here who have then been painted out at a later date. In our painting, there's no sign of the artist changing their mind or of adjusting or reworking anything. And that's likely because they're copying directly from something else. They're not kind of rethinking a composition as they're going along. So it looks as though the painting is copied from the print by someone who may not have had a connection with Hogarth. So it sort of opens up the question of when it might have been painted. So it was quite important to find out whether it was painted around the time, or could it perhaps have been something that was painted later. And looking at the paint itself, we're able to give a lot more idea about the possible date of the painting. Yeah. So cross-sections taken through the paint film are used to demonstrate how the painting is built up, so how many layers of paint there are and what kind of pigments were used. This involves taking a tiny sample of paint from an inconspicuous area of the painting, so that's marked with the X in the top left there. There were these two losses in the paint. So there's a tiny sample of paint is taken from there, sort of the size of a piece of dust. You can see in the scale it's less than a millimetre in size, or well, a tiny, tiny fraction of a millimetre in size. And then with that sample, you look at it from a side perspective under the microscope. So you can see everything from the priming layers at the bottom right up to the top layer of varnish, the final thing applied to the surface on the top. And we look at them in normal light and in ultraviolet light as well, because it gives you different sets of information. And once you've got these samples, it's possible to carry out analysis, which you can use to find out what elements the paint contains, and from that you can work out what pigments they used and kind of what date those pigments were available. So this canvas has two white priming layers, here and here. There's a very thin line between the two, which were made of chalk and lead white, probably bound in oil. And there's a thin layer of a proteinaceous material between the two, which is probably an animal glue. And that's a completely standard method used in 18th century British painting at that time. That's absolutely what you would expect to see on an 18th century painting. And those two layers probably wouldn't have been applied by the artist himself. They'd have been, he'd have bought a prepared canvas from a commercial colourman who'd have prepared large sheets of canvas with this priming, and then it would be cut up and stretched and sold to artists. We can identify some of the materials used in the painting by carrying out elemental analysis on parts of the paint sample. And at the Courtauld, the students in the conservation department have an arrangement. There's a fortunate that they have an arrangement with the chemistry department at King's College London. So students are able to take paint samples there to King's to analyse in their scanning electron microscope, or SEM. So the sample is put inside the SEM, and then we use a method called EDX, which stands for Energy Dispersive X-ray Spectroscopy, to identify elements that are present in a particular part of the sample. And just the basics of that, it works by shooting a beam of electrons at the sample and then measuring the energy change that occurs when the electrons that are being shot dislodge electrons from the atoms in the sample. You can measure that energy change, and that's specific to each element. And the outcome that you get is a spectrum that shows you peaks, which help you identify what elements are there in the spot that you analysed. And once you know what elements are there, you can use that to establish the pigments that we used. So this pigment here shows, at the far left, PB for lead, and right next to it, Ca for calcium. And knowing that there's lead and calcium present in the ground layer of the painting, and knowing kind of what materials were available and commonly used at the time, it's kind of reasonable to assume that these indicate the presence of the pigment lead white and of chalk or calcium carbonate, which was the standard composition for priming layers at that time. Other pigments that were found in the painting include earth pigments like yellow ochre and umber. Lead white was there, and carbon black. The trousers were painted with Prussian blue, and there's also vermilion. The red pigment used is vermilion. So the materials that were used are completely in keeping with 18th century painting methods. These pigments were all in common use at the time. There aren't any pigments of later invention. And bearing in mind, within 100 years of Hogarth painting, Hogarth making the print, by the 19th century, you get a whole new range of pigments that were being developed by kind of new chemical innovations. So things like cobalt blue and chrome yellow and synthetic ultramarine. And none of those were found in this painting at all. So everything that's here was very much what was being used in the 18th century. There were some further interesting details about the paint itself that became more apparent when looking closely at the surface under magnification. Certain areas of the painting, particularly in the lighter colours, had a really kind of mottled-looking appearance. And on closer inspection, it became clear that this was due to a distinctive crack pattern at a really microscopic scale. This is only a couple of millimeters across, that photograph, where these cracks have formed in the paint, and the surface is kind of broken up into these tiny polygonal islands. And these segments of paint had a kind of cup-shaped topography. So you can see it most clearly if you shine a light at an angle there and look under magnification. You can see there's all these pits across the surface. Because of this deformation, over time, varnish and dirt had kind of pooled in those deformations in the paint surface. And as it darkened over time, it had left this really speckled surface. So you've got just a lot more varnish in those dots than you've got elsewhere in the painting. It's not a unique effect. It was identified, this particular phenomenon, in the early 90s by Rika Jones, who's a conservator at the Tate, who's done a lot of research into British paintings of the 18th century. And she describes this using the term microcissing, which is a term kind of based on a term used in the paint technology industry. And it's a form of cracking that's particularly common in late 18th century British painting. Literally just the second half of the 18th century is kind of really when you see a lot of this phenomenon occurring. And so the example I'm showing here is from this painting, which is by Hogarth himself. And so the presence of this phenomenon, it's not something you can use conclusively to date the painting, but it does seem very notable that the painting displays a phenomenon that's so particular to the late 18th century. So all the evidence we have is pointing to this object having been made not too long after the print was produced in 1747, so perhaps within 50 years or so of Hogarth's print. However, the effect of that interesting crack phenomenon was quite an unpleasant and disruptive effect. It was really disrupting the composition. It made it much harder to read what was going on in the lighter passages of paint, so kind of in the flesh and the clothes and the bedspread, and in the white jar, well, the once white jar down at the bottom right of the painting. And on top of that, there was also the darker passages of the painting were already barely legible due to the thick varnish and overpaint. So the treatment that was carried out aimed first and foremost to make the painting function as a picture again and to allow it to really be seen properly. So the treatment that was carried out involved removing the thick varnish and overpaint using small cotton swabs that were dampened with solvents after having carried out several tests across the painting to make sure that the solvent wouldn't affect the paint. The presence of overpaint, so later editions that were made by someone else, not Hogarth, could be seen in the cross sections, and you can also see it looking at the surface of the painting under the microscope. So here, looking at it in UV, you can see that on top of the paint, we've got a couple of layers of varnish which are separated by these dark specks are a layer of dirt, so it's had enough time to accumulate some dirt before the further layers have been added. And then this layer here is something that's been added to, it's overpaint that's been added by someone else, and that's blocking you from seeing the original paint underneath. And as I said, it was possible to see that material on top of the original paint by looking through the microscope in the studio. So as I went along cleaning, I was able to check in each area that I was working where the overpaint was, and I knew what I was working on. That material had been applied in an attempt to strengthen the lines in the composition which had become unclear due to the cracking up of the surface that I've just described, and also some abrasion to the surface, which was probably caused by an earlier over-aggressive cleaning of the kind that was kind of carried out in the 18th or 19th century, before we had the kind of techniques of understanding and carrying out treatments that we do now. And so that's a phenomenon that is seen fairly often, sadly, on older paintings, which were treated by people who didn't have the means to treat them as safely as we do today. But that overpaint was not serving the function that it was supposed to at all. Over time, the medium discolored and it had become muddy, and it was doing, as you can see, a lot more to obscure than to clarify the composition. And so that material was removed along with the varnish using the same method of cotton swabs dampened with solvent. That topography of the paint surface that I was talking about made it very difficult to remove the degraded varnish from inside those microscopic bits of paint. I was able to remove some of this material mechanically under the microscope, which helped to improve the appearance. You can see this is during that stage. You're starting to be able to see more of the white paint underneath, but you've still got this very kind of speckly appearance. And there was only so far I was able to take that cleaning safely. So an important stage in making the painting readable again was to carry out retouching to visually reduce the effect of some of the more distracting changes that had occurred over time, and to kind of allow the original paint to be seen more clearly without the eye being drawn to areas of dirt or abrasion that were otherwise making the composition less clear. But at the same time, of course, it was important to avoid the kind of excessive overpainting that was carried out in that much earlier restoration. And so the idea with our modern conservation practices is just to increase the clarity of what the painter painted by kind of visually knocking back the non-original aspects that get in the way, but really allowing the original paint to not covering up the original paint. So the two photographs at the top left and top right show the difference that was made by the retouching. So on the left, this is a photo that was taken after that varnish and overpaint were removed. I'm sorry, it's a slightly dark photo. It's not as clear as it could be. But so that's the painting after it had been cleaned and a new clear varnish layer had been applied. The patches of white you can see are a putty made of chalk and gelatin that were used to fill in the holes in the paint surface to bring the surface to an even level with the paint. That's just, our eyes are very sensitive to texture, so even if you got the color match exactly right, if you didn't have the surface at the same level, those damages would still catch your eye and they'd be distracting and kind of confusing. So the retouching is then carried out on top of those white fills, and we use in conservation pigments bound in a range of synthetic resins to carry out retouching. And these are media that are known to have stable aging properties so that they won't discolor nearly as quickly as other media. And they'll remain easily removable in solvents that won't have any effect on the paint. So the idea is to keep everything as reversible as possible so that the non-original material which we add today will always remain clearly distinguishable from the original paint. You can always identify it easily, and it can always be easily removed in the future. As well as retouching those areas of kind of complete loss in the painting, I also carried out some retouching to help integrate the areas that had been made less legible by the microsissing and by the past overcleaning. So where that kind of disruptive cracking was most pronounced, I'm just using this example of Tom's face to show you. So these kind of lines around the nose and sort of in the forehead, you can see that were really broken up by that cracking effect. And so those, you just kind of dot in very small amounts of retouching to help them read a bit more solidly and make a bit more sense. And where there was still discolored varnish that had pooled in these surfaces and couldn't be removed, those I would take the color of the paint underneath them and dot them out on top so that you just get a much greater sense of what's going on there. You can see the highlights much more clearly and you can see the outlines much more clearly. So once that was all completed, the painting ended up looking like this, which hopefully you'll agree is clearer to see and a bit more, a bit kind of livelier and a bit closer to what the original painting would have looked like. And as Tom said, it's now on display here, just sort of around the corner. So if anyone hasn't been to have a look at it yet. But that was the kind of the conclusion of the treatment, and so it's sort of nice to be able to bring that painting back out of those kind of centuries of dirt and grime and varnish. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any about the treatment. It took a while, it took a long time. So this was, it was carried out as part of my training, so under very, very close supervision, of course, but one nice thing about that is that it means that you do have the time to carry out all that technical analysis that you don't always once you finish training. So I was in the studio, I was working on a couple of paintings at the same time, several paintings on the same time, but it was in the studio for several months, probably a year, including kind of working on other things at the same time, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're sort of, it's quite a small thing and you kind of get to know every inch of the surface by the end. Yeah.
Do you suppose it might have been a fake? No, tried passed off as a Hogarth?
I don't know that enough about what kind of the 18th century market was like that for, but I can imagine bearing in mind it was probably carried out within Hogarth's lifetime, roughly, it would be a bit cheeky to try and pass off, I would think. I don't know, I think there was definitely, in that period of time, there is a big market for kind of reproductions of things and not necessarily selling them as something else, but you couldn't kind of, you couldn't buy reproductions of paintings so easily as we can today, to hang on your wall. So in a sense, commissioning someone to paint a small reproduction kind of probably would have been within the means of middle class society, and yeah, I'm not, yeah.
Was the original Hogarth the sort of kind of allegorical image of a broken bed, or is that something that had a longer tradition, do you know?
That's not something I know, actually. It's that's
I've never seen it before, so I'm thinking of Tracy Emin and things like that.
Yeah, it's sort of an 18th century Tracy Emin in this picture, I think. That's actually that was a really interesting question. It would be interesting to know. Yeah.
I haven't seen it before.
Any more questions? So I think we should start by giving you a round. I found that fascinating, so thank you. It's revealed the science behind the magic of those pictures appeared. I think it's a real testament to your skill, but now when I look at this picture, all I see is this beautiful glossy surface and a fantastically preserved painting. And you have no awareness that any of that work has taken place. It just looks beautifully clean and lovely. And as Claire said, if anyone would like to see the picture, it's just through here, and on the left, if you follow through, you'll see the door is open. It is genuinely that way. It seems like you're in a labyrinth kind of a route bit. Do go and have a look. It's beautifully lit, and you can see a modern reproduction of the Industry and Idleness series just next door. And do join us for a glass of wine as well, which will be appearing very shortly. And here I just need to go and get the chilled bottles. So thank you very much for coming.